In January 2017, the day before Donald Trump was inaugurated, Anthony Fauci made the following statement in a speech at Georgetown University. "If there is a message I want to leave with you today, based on my experience, is that there is no question that there will be a challenge for the upcoming administration in the area of infectious diseases, both chronic infectious diseases in the sense of already ongoing disease, but there will be a surprise outbreak." Now, that would have to be one of the most incredible statements of this century, that a scientist could predict a surprise outbreak in the term of an elected president. Now, I don't know about you, but I didn't know that viruses were political. But yet here we have a scientist, head of the infectious disease department in the United States, predicting 3 years in advance of COVID that there would be a surprise outbreak, infectious disease outbreak. Now, when you Google this, Reuters will come up with a fact check and they'll say, oh yes, it's all true, he said that, but he didn't say it was coronavirus, he didn't say it was COVID. Well, it doesn't really matter. The fact of the matter is there needs to be serious questions asked about what Anthony Fauci knew about the origins of coronavirus. And I well remember at the start of the outbreak, when Australia was locked down and the world, most of the world, certainly the Western world, was locked down incessantly for the next 2 years amongst the barrage of fear-mongering that our then Foreign Minister, Senator Maurice Payne, called for an investigation into the origins of coronavirus. But yet here we are, 4 years removed to the month from the outbreak of that disease, from the time when these lockdowns occurred, and there's crickets. There is absolute crickets about the origins of coronavirus. And that is not fair to the Australian people or the people in other parts of the world that had to endure government overreach in the name of keeping people safe. Australian people have a right to know if that virus was an actual lab leak as a result of gain-of-function research. And they have a right to know that our intelligence agencies and our law enforcement agencies are monitoring this type of gain-of-function research, both in our universities, and it is occurring, and in other universities across the world. Because we do not want to see another outbreak of the fear-mongering, the government fear-mongering, that we saw 4 years ago. And I just want to call out this, we often hear now the narrative today is that, there's another pandemic around the corner. Now, when I grew up, I never heard any sort of language like that, and there's comparisons back to the Spanish flu and how that was a really bad outbreak, and that another outbreak like the Spanish flu can occur again. It is highly unlikely that another outbreak like the Spanish flu will occur again, for the very simple reason for the discovery of penicillin. What killed most people in the Spanish flu wasn't the virus, it was the bacterial infection, the secondary bacterial infection that occurs when you get a virus infection in the first instance. And it was probably what killed most people in those Victorian aged care centres in August 2020. But yet again, do we investigate this? No, we don't want to look at it. So this fear-mongering and this narrative that somehow we've got to be prepared for the next pandemic outbreak is overblown, because we have this wonderful invention, probably the most important invention of the 20th century, called antibiotics, and in particular penicillin. So this fear-mongering needs to stop, because I fear that those people on the other side of the chamber and those people who seem to think that the world should be governed from the top down rather than from the bottom up, it suits them all too well to do with our health what they've done to the weather. And that is that only the big government can save you. Only big corporations can save you. Well, that rubbish needs to stop, because people need to be responsible for their own actions, not the paternalism of big government stepping and overstepping into the daily lives of everyday people. That is not what liberal democracy is about. But I digress, because I actually want to go back and talk about the origins of the coronavirus. Because, you see, the strange thing is, just after the outbreak of the coronavirus, is that there was a series of leaked emails amongst a number of key professors who somehow knew Anthony Fauci. And Anthony Fauci was in contact with these professors. And if you actually look at the early leaks, before Anthony Fauci started talking to the intelligence agencies, they were all convinced that this outbreak was a gain-of-function outbreak because there was a furin cleavage site. Now, furin is an enzyme that attaches the ACE receptor off the virus, the spike protein from the virus to the ACE receptor of your cells. It was designed to speed up infection. Right now, this was completely novel, and the chances of this happening in nature is like a big bang. I've had a number of microbiologists tell me the chances of this happening is extremely unlikely. And that was the viewpoint of a number of scientists, and I'll name them: Christian Anderson, Edward Holmes, Ian Lipkin, Andrew Ramboll and Robert Garry. Now, these 5 scientists just happened to get into an email trail with Anthony Fauci, and they went from going, this is an actual lab leak, gain of function, to it can't possibly be gain of function, it's natural evolution, and anyone that possibly suggests it's gain of function is a conspiracy theorist. Well, it turns out that Anthony Fauci actually funded an organisation called EcoHealth. Now, this EcoHealth was run by a man by the name of Peter Daszak, and he was the lead author in a paper published by The Lancet that was published not long after the coronavirus was used to lock everyone down, that completely ridiculed the notion that coronavirus was actually gain-of-function research. And I should read some of the comments that were made, and in particular Edward Holmes. And the reason why I want to concentrate on Edward Holmes is that he's an Australian scientist who works at Sydney University. He has received over $4 million in research for viruses. Now, one of the comments he made very early on in this email trail was Ian Lipkin just called, very worried about the furin cleavage site, and says that high-ups are too, including intelligence. Also saw the restriction site. Ian Lipkin's comments about Edward Holmes was, Dr Holmes became very unhappy with me after I refused to sign on and say that, there was proof that this began in the wet market. Now, there is clear evidence of an email trail suggesting that there was a cover-up as to the origins of the coronavirus. And this cover-up was actually led by people who were working in gain-of-function research and who were actually funded by the US government, albeit working in China. Now, the other thing worth noting is this Professor Holmes was actually an honorary professor at the Chinese Centre for Disease Control. Now, when I raised this issue in estimates with ASIO and other intelligence organisations, they have absolutely no interest in investigating Professor Edward Holmes from Sydney University, despite the fact that he's received millions of dollars in Australia's taxpayers' funding, despite the fact that he was one of only 6 scientists that Anthony Fauci decided to talk about the origins of coronavirus with, and despite the fact that he was an honorary professor at the Chinese Centre for Disease Control. Now, I don't know about you, but I would have thought this needs to be investigated. And the question I want to leave with my constituents today, the constituents and my fellow Australians out there today, why aren't Australian intelligence agencies, as well as intelligence agencies in other countries, interested in investigating the origins of coronavirus, the gain of research that was involved with the origins of coronavirus, who funded it, and why there was a cover-up? Because we owe it to the Australian people that this sort of government overreach can never happen again.
Authorised G. Rennick, LNP Chermside.